So far, we've worked with fairly simple validations. All we had to do was check some options, type in some ranges, and create some value lists. These validations basically have one purpose. Let's look at a way at adding almost any type of validation that you can think of. And that's by doing a calculated validation. What we're going to do is some basic ones, but once you get better at calculations, you'll be able to improve upon them. We're going to start with requiring the email address to have an @ sign. Now, that's probably very short-sighted because an email address has to have a lot of components, but that's the easiest one to check for right away, and something it has to have. So let's go into Manage Database. We'll find our email field right there. Go into Options, and we can keep unique value, no problem, but we can also check Validated by Calculation. Now, we've looked at this dialog before, and there's a lot to it. There's the fields, the operators, the functions. And we used a function before, but we're going to really describe what a function is and help you understand it, because before we just kind of briefly went over it. So what we're going to do is scroll down through these functions to find the one we want. The one we want is called pattern count. You'll see that there's quite a few here. Don't get overwhelmed. You don't use all these, or at least most people don't. I use maybe a fraction of these 90% of the time. When we get down to pattern count, what you do is you can click on it and look at it, highlight it, or you can double click on it and it pulls it down into your formula. Let's talk about the anatomy of a function. Every function has a name. It has to have a name. There's no choice. You have to have a name for your function. It tells it what to do. It gives it definition. It gives it purpose. Most functions have parameters, which are enclosed in these parentheses. Some don't, but the majority do have parameters. And the parameters are separated by this semicolon. So the parameters tell that function how it's going to work. And in this case, how it's going to work is it's going to look inside of this parameter, this text string here, which could be a field if we wanted to, and search for this value that we put in here. And if it finds it, return how many times it finds it. If it finds it once, it returns a 1. Twice, it returns a 2. 3, it returns a 3. It doesn't find it at all, returns a 0. So pattern count just returns a number. So what we're going to do, well, we're going to change this parameter. This is just a holding spot for it. We're going to change it to email. So we come down and find the email field and say look inside the email field, and then change this to quote and do the @ sign and then a quote. Now we could go ahead and change this to another function called self if we want. You'll see it in here if we scroll down farther. And self is one of those functions that doesn't have any parameters. It just simply says, look at myself. In other words, what this does for you, rather than typing an email, they work no differently, except that this makes it more dynamic. I can take this formula, copy it to my clipboard, and paste it into my email shipping, and it'll automatically work. And with this quote, @ sign, quote, we could have used a quote up here. Would have worked just fine. You just hit the quotes, and then type in the @ sign. Same thing. I just like typing things better, and you'll find out as we get more into calculations, I'll type more in there. In fact, I won't even look over here after a while. So there's your formula. Now, in order for us to understand how this is going to work in validation, you need to read this little message down here. Every calculation dialog has it. This calculation result must be Boolean. Right down here it says what it is. Must be Boolean. Here's the definition of Boolean. It says non-zero values are true, 0 and empty values are false. So 1 is true. -1 is true. 15,672,485.69 is also true. The only things that are false are 0 and empty. So that works out perfectly here. If we find no @ signs, it will return 0. If we find 1 or 2 or 3, it's going to give us a true and not validate it. So it doesn't work perfectly. We're not trying to get the perfect formula here. We're trying to teach a little bit about validation. So it doesn't work if somebody accidentally types in 2 @ signs. It's not going to work. It's going to let it go. But we're not trying to get the perfect formula here. There's lots of other things wrong with this formula. There's lots of ways to validate an email address. This is just a simple approach to get the most basic validation down. So we'll click OK. Click OK again. Click OK. And we'll try to go ahead and remove this. If we go ahead and remove it and then click to another field, it doesn't validate until we commit. So it's more like the is empty. And more like the is empty, it has the revert record rather than the revert field. So What we're going to do next is look at these options and how to change them. We don't like this message here. It's not very clear. And I really don't want some of these options here, such as yes. That allows us to keep that. I really don't like that. I want to make sure that no matter what, there's at least one @ sign in there so it validates it as true.